Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The ski lift swayed gently as we ascended the mountain, and I found myself sitting next to a weathered man in his late 40s who introduced himself as Tom. His hands bore the calluses of someone who'd spent years working outdoors, and there was something in his eyes, a distant, haunted quality that made me curious. We started with small talk about the powder conditions, but when he mentioned he'd spent several years living in the South Dakota Badlands, tracking wildlife movements for conservation research, I perked up. "Ever run into anything unusual out there?" I asked, thinking of the stories I'd heard about strange encounters in remote wilderness areas. Tom's expression shifted. He stared out at the snow-covered peaks for a long moment before responding. "Not in South Dakota, no, but Kansas." He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "Kansas is where something happened that I still can't explain, even now, 12 years later." The lift continued its mechanical ascent, and I waited, sensing he needed a moment to gather his thoughts. The wind picked up slightly, causing the chair to rock, and Tom gripped the safety bar a little tighter. I noticed his knuckles had gone white. "This was back in 2010, he finally continued, his voice lower now, almost as if he didn't want anyone else to hear, though we were the only ones on the lift. I was 36, still in decent shape from my army days, and my buddy Gerald, we'd served together in Iraq, had convinced me to do this hiking trip along an old trail in eastern Kansas. Historic route used during the frontier days, ran right through some seriously isolated terrain." Tom pulled out his phone and showed me a map. His finger traced a thin line cutting through what looked like endless forest and hills. "We were documenting bird migration patterns. Gerald was really into ornithology, had all this expensive camera equipment. We'd been planning this trip for months, waited for the right season when the migration was at its peak." He paused, zooming in on a particular section of the map. "This is where it happened." The spot he indicated was surrounded by dense topographical lines, indicating steep terrain and heavy forest cover. No roads nearby, no towns for miles, just wilderness. "I've been camping my whole life," Tom said, his voice taking on an edge I hadn't heard before. "Spent months in combat zones, survived situations that should have killed me. I'm not someone who scares easily, but what happened out there?" He shook his head slowly. "That was different. That was something I wasn't trained for." Tom described how they'd set out on a Thursday morning, packs loaded with gear for a 4-day trek. The weather had been perfect, clear skies, temperatures in the mid-60s, ideal conditions for both hiking and wildlife observation. Gerald had been in high spirits, pointing out various bird species as they made their way along the narrow trail that wound through increasingly dense forest. "The first day and a half were completely normal," Tom explained. "We covered good ground, saw exactly what we expected to see. Gerald was getting some incredible shots. Warblers, thrushes, raptors. The forest was alive with sound. You know that constant background noise you get in wooded areas. Birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling, small animals moving through the undergrowth. It creates this natural symphony that you almost stop noticing after a while." He fell quiet for a moment, and I could see him struggling with what came next. "It was the afternoon of the second day when everything changed. We were following the trail through a particularly isolated section, maybe 15 miles from the nearest road, when the sound just stopped. And I don't mean it gradually faded. I mean everything went completely, utterly silent in the span of maybe 5 seconds, like someone had flipped a switch." Tom's hands were trembling slightly now. "I've been in the wilderness enough to know that's not natural. Animals go quiet for a reason, usually because there's a predator nearby. But this wasn't normal quiet. This was wrong. The air felt different, heavier somehow." I looked at Gerald, and I could see he'd noticed it too. His camera was lowered, and he was scanning the tree line, this confused expression on his face. According to Tom, they'd stopped walking and stood there for several minutes, waiting for the normal sounds to resume. But the silence persisted, thick and oppressive. No birds, no insects, not even wind through the leaves, just their own breathing and the pounding of their hearts. "That's when I heard it," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper now. This screaming, a woman's voice, absolutely terrified, shrieking like someone was murdering her. And it wasn't distant. It sounded close, maybe 100 yards away, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest, off the trail. What happened next was perhaps the most disturbing part of Tom's account. He described how the screaming continued, this agonized female voice crying out in what sounded like genuine terror and pain. The sound seemed to echo through the hills, bouncing off the terrain in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the exact source. His immediate instinct was to help. Years of military training had conditioned him to respond to distress calls. I started moving toward the sound, Tom said, his face tense with the memory. I was already pushing through the brush, my hand on the knife on my belt, when Gerald grabbed my arm. He was staring at me like I'd lost my mind. "What are you doing?" he asked. And I said, "We need to help her. Can't you hear that screaming?" But Gerald just looked more confused and said, "What screaming?" Tom described the chill that went through him at those words. The screaming was still going on. He could hear it clearly, desperately clear, this woman's voice calling out in terror. But Gerald heard nothing. They stood there arguing about it, Gerald insisting the forest was completely silent except for their voices. Tom becoming increasingly agitated because the screaming wouldn't stop. "I pulled out my phone to try to record it," Tom continued, "but when I played it back there was nothing, just silence. But I could still hear her screaming in real time, while the recording captured nothing. That's when I started to realize something was very, very wrong." Gerald had wanted to leave immediately, but Tom was transfixed by the sound. He described how the screaming would occasionally form into words, "Help me," and "Please," and "They're coming," before dissolving back into wordless shrieks. The voice seemed to be moving, circling them through the forest, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but never quite revealing its source. "Gerald thought I was having some kind of psychological break," Tom said. "And I started wondering if maybe he was right. But I knew what I was hearing. It was real to me, as real as your voice is right now, but only to me." After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, Tom said the screaming finally stopped. The silence returned, just as absolute as before, and then gradually, the normal sounds of the forest began to creep back. First a tentative bird call, then another, then insects, until everything sounded normal again. But the damage was done. Gerald was spooked, and Tom was shaken in a way he'd never experienced before. "We should have left right then," Tom said, his voice heavy with regret. "We should have packed up and hiked straight back to the trailhead. But we didn't. God help us, we didn't." Tom and Gerald stood on that trail for nearly an hour, debating what to do. Gerald was convinced his friend had experienced some kind of auditory hallucination, maybe dehydration, maybe altitude sickness, though they weren't high enough for that to make much sense. Tom couldn't shake the certainty that what he'd heard was real, even if he couldn't explain why Gerald hadn't heard it, or why it hadn't recorded on his phone. "I think part of me was in denial," Tom admitted. "I didn't want to believe I was hearing things that weren't there. That scared me more than the idea of something actually being out in those woods. At least if it was real, I could deal with it. But if my own mind was playing tricks on me, that was terrifying in a different way." They compromised by continuing on the trail but staying hyper-alert. Gerald packed away his camera equipment, and both men kept their hiking poles ready as makeshift weapons. Tom had a .45 pistol in his pack. He always carried when hiking in remote areas, and he moved it to a more accessible pocket. The weight of it was reassuring, even though he wasn't sure what good it would do against something he couldn't see or locate. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, but Tom described a persistent feeling of being watched. "I kept catching movement in my peripheral vision," he said. "Just shadows, flickers of darkness between the trees. Every time I'd turn to look directly, there'd be nothing there. But I could feel eyes on us." Gerald felt it too, even though he didn't say anything at first. "I could tell by the way he kept checking behind us, the way his shoulders were tensed up." As evening approached, they reached a small clearing that seemed like a reasonable spot to camp for the night. It was far from ideal, exposed on one side, backed by dense forest on the others, but they were running out of daylight and didn't want to be setting up camp in the dark. They worked quickly and efficiently, barely speaking as they erected their bivy sacks and prepared a cold dinner, neither wanting to deal with a fire. The sun seemed to set faster than it should have, Tom recalled. 1 minute there was still reasonable light, and the next, it was dark, really dark. The kind of darkness you only get in places far from any human lights, where the canopy is thick enough to block out even the stars. That's when Tom described the sounds beginning again. Not the screaming this time, but other noises, footsteps circling their camp, the snap of twigs, the rustle of something large moving through the underbrush. And this time Gerald could hear them too. Neither of us slept that first hour, Tom said. We just lay there in our bivy sacks, listening. The sounds would come from one direction, then another. Sometimes it sounded like something was moving in a wide circle around our camp. Other times it seemed to be getting closer, then pulling back, like it was testing us, seeing how we'd react. Tom had his pistol out, lying on his chest, his finger near the trigger guard. He described staring into the darkness, seeing nothing but occasionally hearing Gerald's sharp intake of breath when a sound came from particularly close by. They'd agreed beforehand not to use their flashlights unless absolutely necessary. No point in making themselves better targets, and besides, the lights would ruin what little night vision they had. Around midnight, that's when I saw it, Tom said, and his voice dropped even lower. Or I think I saw it. I can't be completely sure even now, but there was this darker shadow among the shadows, standing behind a tree at the edge of the clearing. Just the outline of something tall, very tall, maybe 7 feet. Way too tall to be a person, and thin, unnaturally thin. He described watching this shape for several minutes, his heart hammering in his chest, his hand gripping the pistol so hard his fingers ached. The shape didn't move at first. It just stood there, and Tom got the overwhelming impression that it was watching him, studying him. Then he saw what might have been an arm, long and skeletal, reach around the tree trunk, as if whatever was behind it was steadying itself or preparing to step out into the clearing. I almost fired, Tom admitted. My finger was on the trigger, and I was ready to put rounds into that thing. But something stopped me. Maybe it was uncertainty. I couldn't be totally sure what I was seeing. Maybe it was fear that shooting would provoke it. Or maybe, he trailed off, shaking his head. Maybe some part of me knew that bullets wouldn't make a difference. Then the shape withdrew, sliding back behind the tree so smoothly it was almost like watching a shadow move independent of any light source. Tom lay there for hours afterward, staring at that spot, waiting for it to return. Eventually, exhaustion began to take its toll, and despite his best efforts to stay awake, he felt his eyes growing heavy. Tom's voice became strained as he described what happened when he finally fell asleep. The dream felt more real than any dream I've ever had, he said. I was suddenly running through the forest, branches whipping at my face, thorns tearing at my arms and legs. I could feel the pain, actual sharp, burning pain. I was running from something, but I didn't know what. I couldn't hear it chasing me, but I knew it was there, right behind me, close enough that I could feel its presence like cold breath on the back of my neck. In the dream, Tom described how he crashed through the underbrush in absolute panic, his heart ready to explode from his chest, his lungs burning. Blood was running down his face from the cuts, getting in his eyes, but he didn't dare slow down. The forest seemed endless, and no matter how fast he ran, he never seemed to make any progress toward safety. Then suddenly, I'd burst out into our campsite, Tom continued, and I'd feel this wave of relief wash over me. I'd made it. I was safe. But then everything would reset, like someone had pressed a rewind button. I'd be back in the forest, running again. The same terror, the same branches cutting my face, the same thing chasing me that I could never see. Over and over and over. He described the dream loop continuing for what felt like hours. Each time he'd reach the camp, each time he'd feel that moment of relief, and each time it would snatch it away and start over. The psychological torture of it was worse than the physical sensation of being cut and chased. He began to expect the reset, to dread that moment of false safety, but he couldn't stop himself from feeling hope each time anyway. I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, Tom said. It was still dark, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. I immediately grabbed my pistol and started scanning the perimeter. Gerald was awake too. He'd been awake the whole time, watching over the camp while I'd been trapped in that nightmare. He looked terrible, completely exhausted, and when I asked if anything had happened, he just shook his head. But Gerald did tell him one thing. While Tom had been asleep, he'd been talking. Not regular sleep talking, but saying the same phrases over and over in a monotone voice. I'm running. It's behind me. I can't stop. I have to reach camp. The same loop externalized, playing out verbally while Tom experienced it internally. Tom described how the remaining hours until dawn felt like an eternity. They both stayed awake, weapons ready, watching the darkness gradually give way to gray pre-dawn light, then finally to the pale gold of sunrise breaking through the trees. The normal sounds of morning, birds beginning their songs, small animals stirring, felt like a blessing after the oppressive silence and strange noises of the night. We didn't even talk about it, Tom said. We just started packing up our gear as fast as we could. Gerald's hands were shaking so badly he could barely stuff his sleeping bag. We abandoned the idea of continuing the hike and made the decision to head straight back to the trailhead. It was supposed to be a 4-day trip, but we cut it to 2.5. Neither of us cared about the birds anymore, or the research, or any of it. We just wanted out of those woods. The hike back was grueling. They pushed themselves hard, taking minimal breaks, driven by an unspoken fear that if they stayed too long in any one place, something might happen again. Tom described constantly checking behind them, unable to shake the feeling of being followed. But the forest seemed normal now. Sounds, smells, everything was as it should be. If not for their shared exhaustion and Gerald's corroboration of the strange events, Tom said he might have convinced himself the whole thing had been some elaborate hallucination. We made it back to Gerald's truck by late afternoon, Tom continued. We threw our gear in the back and got the hell out of there. Drove straight through, 6 hours to Gerald's place in Topeka. We didn't even stop for food. Gerald kept driving until we hit city limits, like he needed to be surrounded by people and lights and civilization before he could feel safe again. They spent that night drinking beer on Gerald's porch, trying to process what had happened. Gerald admitted he'd heard things he couldn't explain and seen shadows that didn't make sense. He'd been too frightened and too proud to say anything during the hike, not wanting to make things worse when Tom was already experiencing the screaming that only he could hear. They talked through every detail, trying to find rational explanations, but came up empty. We promised each other we wouldn't talk about it again, Tom said. It felt like acknowledging it might somehow bring it back into our lives, so we just didn't. Gerald moved to Oregon a year later, and we lost touch. I don't know if he ever told anyone else about what happened. Tom was quiet for a moment as the ski lift approached the top of the mountain. Around us, other skiers were getting ready to disembark, but I was completely absorbed in his story. For years I tried to forget about it, he said. I convinced myself it had been stress, or bad food, or some combination of factors that created a perfect storm of weirdness. But it stuck with me. I'd be lying if I said it didn't change me. I became more cautious in isolated areas, more attuned to when things felt off, and I had nightmares. Not the same looping one from that night, but variations on it, being chased by something I could never see. In 2012, Tom said, he was browsing online and came across articles about historical frontier encounters in Kansas. He learned about the Native American tribes that had lived in the area where he and Gerald had their experience, the Kickapoo and others. He read about their folklore, their warnings about certain places and certain entities that were said to inhabit the remote wilderness areas. There were accounts from the 1800s, Tom explained, of settlers reporting similar experiences, hearing voices calling out in distress, seeing tall shadows moving between trees, experiencing vivid nightmares when they camped in certain areas. Some of the accounts were eerily similar to what happened to us. People hearing screams that others couldn't hear, feeling watched by something that couldn't quite be seen. But what really shook Tom was learning about the pattern of these encounters. They all happened in similar terrain, isolated forests, away from established trails, in areas where people rarely ventured, and they all involved some form of auditory lure, something designed to draw people away from safety and deeper into the wilderness. The historical accounts mentioned people who'd followed these sounds and never returned, or who'd been found days later incoherent and traumatized, with no memory of what had happened to them. I realized how close we'd come, Tom said softly. If I'd followed that screaming, if I'd left Gerald and gone into the woods alone, I don't think I would have come back. Whatever was out there, it was trying to separate us, to isolate one of us from the other. And once it had done that, he didn't finish the sentence. The ski lift came to a stop and we prepared to disembark. Tom stood up, adjusting his ski poles, but before we parted ways, he turned to me one more time. I still can't tell you what it was, he said. I'm not someone who believes in supernatural things, or at least I wasn't. I like rational explanations, scientific reasons for why things happen, but I also know what I experienced. I know what I heard, what I saw, what I felt, and I know it was real. He glanced out at the mountain, the snow-covered slopes, the forests below us. These days, I stick to the ski resorts. controlled environments, plenty of people around. I'm done with isolated wilderness. Whatever is out there in those Kansas woods, it can have them. I'm not going back. As Tom skied away, I stood there for a moment, processing everything he'd told me. The sun was shining, people were laughing and skiing around me. The world felt normal and safe, but I couldn't shake the image he'd painted, that clearing in the Kansas forest, the tall shadow behind the tree, the screaming that only one person could hear, and the terrible night that followed. I think about Tom's story often now. I wonder what really happened to him and Gerald out there. I wonder about all the wilderness areas across this country, the places where people rarely go, where the forest is thick and the darkness is absolute. I wonder what might be living in those spaces, what might be watching from the shadows, waiting for someone to wander too far from safety. And when I'm hiking now, I pay attention to the sounds around me. I notice when things go too quiet. I trust my instincts when something feels wrong, because Tom's story taught me something important. Sometimes the most frightening things aren't the ones we can explain. Sometimes they're the ones that we know, deep in our bones, are real, even when all logic tells us they shouldn't be. This particular story happened when I was a teenager, more than 15 years ago now. I grew up in the Adirondacks, spending most of my childhood and teenage years camping or just generally being outside in some capacity. The wilderness was my sanctuary, my playground, and eventually the setting for something that would haunt my dreams for decades to come. 2 summers in a row, I joined a conservation group that would travel around the rural back roads and pick up any garbage that inconsiderate people had dumped. Mostly it was just a cleaning job, usually along the roadside where beer cans and fast food wrappers accumulated like urban tumbleweeds. The work was honest and gave me a sense of purpose. Plus, it paid enough to keep me in camping gear and hiking boots. Our group consisted of about 12 teenagers, all of us outdoorsy types who preferred the company of trees to the drama of high school hallways. The program was run by Carlton, a grizzled park ranger in his 50s who'd seen everything the mountains could throw at a person. He had stories that could curl your hair, and scars that mapped out adventures I could only dream of having. Occasionally, however, we would be asked by the rangers to clean up trails or county roads where people would dump their trash deeper in the woods. These were the jobs that separated the serious volunteers from the ones just looking for easy community service hours. The deeper you went into the wilderness, the stranger the things people discarded became. On that particular day in late July, the air was thick with humidity and the promise of an afternoon thunderstorm. The group I was in had to split up and take different quadrants to cover more ground efficiently. We were each given GPS units, though back then their accuracy was usually within 100 meters if you were lucky. The technology was primitive compared to what we have now, and the thick canopy often interfered with the signal. This wasn't an issue for me, as I had dreams of being a trail guide or forest ranger back then. I could navigate by compass, read topographical maps, and identify landmarks that most people would walk right past. The woods were my element, and I felt more comfortable alone on a mountain trail than I did in my own bedroom. However, others in the group were uncomfortable with the isolation, and chose to stay closer to the main roads where cell service was spotty but existent. This left me volunteering to be dropped off at the end of Forest Service Road 47, walking my way back to the agreed area of pickup several miles away. Carlton handed me extra supplies since I'd be working alone. "You sure about this, kid?" he asked, squinting at me from under his faded Park Service cap. "That area's gotten some complaints lately. People dumping all sorts of nasty stuff back there." I assured him I could handle it. At 17, I thought I was invincible, and I'd seen enough dumped garbage to know what to expect. Or so I thought. We each were given a roll of heavy-duty garbage bags and a poke stick to collect the trash safely. The poke stick was essential gear. You never knew what might be hiding under a pile of refuse, from broken glass to used needles to things that might bite back. The area I was dropped off at was known for being one of the larger illegal dump sites in the region. People would drive their pickup trucks down the old logging road and drop off their old couches, chairs, mattresses, and other various pieces of furniture rather than pay the dump fees. It was a constant battle between the rangers and the lazy cheapskates who treated the wilderness like their personal landfill. Fortunately, someone with a flatbed truck had already come through earlier that week, picking up the larger pieces under Carlton's supervision. All that was left were the smaller items. bottles that caught the filtered sunlight like broken emeralds, rusted cans that had been slowly poisoning the soil for God knows how long, plastic bags that fluttered from tree branches like prayer flags to human carelessness, papers that had been reduced to pulp by rain and time, and anything else people were too lazy to dispose of properly. The work was methodical and peaceful at first. I fell into a rhythm of scan, poke, grab, and bag. The forest around me hummed with the normal sounds of summer. Insects droning, birds calling to their mates, the distant sound of a woodpecker working on a dead oak. Occasionally, a chipmunk would scold me for disturbing its territory, and I'd find myself apologizing to the little creature as if it could understand. Unfortunately, once in a while during these cleanup operations, you would find things dumped of a much darker nature than furniture and household waste. Sometimes people disposed of things that made your stomach turn, and your faith in humanity waver. Dead animals were common enough. Pets that had been taken care of in inhumane ways rather than brought to a veterinarian for proper euthanasia. Carlton had warned us about this possibility during our training, though he tried to shield the younger volunteers from the worst discoveries. "If you find anything that makes you uncomfortable," he'd said, "mark the location and walk away. Call it in on the radio and we'll handle it." But I hadn't been given a radio that day. There were only so many to go around, and I was considered experienced enough to work independently. That decision would prove to be a mistake that haunted both me and Carlton for years afterward. About 2 hours into my work, as I was pulling a tattered plastic tarp from where it had been snagged on a low branch, I discovered something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Underneath the tarp, partially hidden by fallen leaves and forest debris, was a cardboard box that had been soaked by rain and was falling apart at the seams. The smell hit me first, that sickly sweet odor of decomposition mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Something that made my nostrils burn and my eyes water. I approached cautiously, using my poke stick to lift the remaining pieces of cardboard away from the contents. Inside were the remains of what had once been a litter of puppies. 7 small bodies, their eyes not yet opened, discarded like garbage by someone who couldn't be bothered with the responsibility of proper animal care. The sight hit me like a physical blow, and I had to step back and breathe deeply to keep from being sick. This wasn't the first time I'd encountered something like this during cleanup operations. Unfortunately, you'd be amazed at how cruel people can be when they think no one is watching, but it never got easier to see, and it always made me question what was wrong with the world that someone could do such a thing to innocent creatures. If I had been given a radio, I would have called it in immediately. The protocol was clear. Discoveries like this needed to be reported so that Carlton and the other adults could handle the situation appropriately and document it for possible law enforcement involvement. They tried to keep us younger volunteers from being exposed to the more serious and disturbing aspects of human cruelty. But standing there alone in the woods, miles from the nearest person, I felt a responsibility to these small creatures that overrode the standard procedures. They deserved better than to rot in a cardboard box like refuse. They deserved dignity, even in death. I made a decision that would change the course of my entire day and, ultimately, my entire relationship with the wilderness I'd always loved. Instead of leaving them with the pile of garbage bags I'd already filled and continuing with my assigned work, I decided to give these poor creatures a proper burial. The decision felt right in the moment, but it meant I would be venturing deeper into the woods than I had originally planned, farther from the marked trails and established roads, farther from civilization and help, should I need it. I dropped off my backpack of supplies and my poke stick near the road, marking the spot with a bright orange ribbon tied to a maple sapling so I could find it again. The day was getting warmer, and I could see storm clouds building on the horizon through the gaps in the canopy. I needed to work quickly if I wanted to complete my task and get back to the pickup point before the weather turned. I walked into the woods carrying only the cardboard box with its tragic contents, my pocket knife, and a water bottle. The forest seemed different once I left the established areas where people regularly traveled. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural cathedral that filtered the sunlight into moving patterns on the forest floor. The normal sounds of the woods continued around me, but they seemed muffled somehow, as if the deeper forest absorbed sound differently than the areas near human activity. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves, and I found myself trying to walk more quietly without really understanding why. I walked for probably 20 minutes, following animal trails and natural clearings, before I found what seemed like an appropriate spot. There was a rather large pine tree, ancient and massive, that stood in a small clearing surrounded by younger growth. The tree had that timeless quality that old-growth forest possesses. You could sense the decades of storms it had weathered, the countless seasons it had witnessed. The spot felt peaceful and dignified, the kind of place where these innocent creatures could rest undisturbed. The ground beneath the pine was softer than the surrounding areas, covered with a thick layer of needles that would make digging easier. I placed the cardboard box gently at the base of the tree and began searching for tools. In the wilderness, you learn to make do with what's available, and I needed something sturdy enough to break ground and move earth. Walking in a slow circle around the great pine, I searched for a stick or rock or similar items that I could use to start excavating a proper grave. The forest provided what I needed. I found a rather large branch that had fallen from one of the surrounding trees. The wood was solid oak, weathered but not rotted, and it was the perfect size for the task at hand. Using my weight and leverage, I was able to break the branch in half, creating a digging tool with a pointed end and a handle I could grip comfortably. I then used my pocket knife to sharpen one end further, carving away the bark and wood until I had created a serviceable spade. The work was harder than I had anticipated. The ground beneath the pine tree looked soft and welcoming from the surface, but underneath the layer of needles and topsoil, I encountered a complex network of roots that had been growing for decades. Each root had to be carefully worked around or cut through with my knife, and the deeper I dug, the more challenging the work became. Sweat began to bead on my forehead despite the cool shade of the forest canopy. The physical labor was demanding, but there was something meditative about it as well. Each scoop of earth brought me closer to completing this small act of compassion in a world that had shown these creatures none. It took me the better part of an hour to dig a hole about 1.5 feet deep, and wide enough to accommodate the small bodies. My hands were raw from gripping the makeshift shovel, and my back ached from bending over the excavation, but I was satisfied with the work. The hole was deep enough to protect the remains from scavengers and weather, and it felt appropriately respectful for the innocent lives that had been so carelessly discarded. I proceeded to lay the small bodies to rest with as much dignity as I could provide. I chose not to bury them in the cardboard box, as I didn't want to add to the trash that was already polluting this pristine area. Instead, I wrapped each tiny form in clean leaves and placed them gently in the earth they would return to. The moment felt sacred in a way that surprised me. Here I was, a teenager alone in the wilderness, performing a funeral service for creatures that would never know they had been mourned. I took a few moments to say a prayer, asking God to receive these innocent souls and to forgive the cruelty of the person who had abandoned them. Tears came unexpectedly as I worked, and I didn't try to stop them. The combination of anger at human cruelty, sadness for unnecessary suffering, and the profound solitude of the deep woods created an emotional intensity I hadn't anticipated. The forest felt like a natural sanctuary, the perfect place for such a solemn ritual. However, as I was covering up the grave with the excavated soil, patting it down gently and arranging the pine needles to restore the natural appearance of the forest floor, I heard a sound that made me pause mid-motion. It was the sharp crack of a small branch breaking, maybe 50 feet to my left. The position I was in, crouched below the low-hanging branches of the great pine, kept me from being able to see the source of the sound clearly, but the snap was distinct and deliberate. Not the random settling of dead wood, but the sound of something substantial stepping on a branch with enough force to break it. I stopped talking and moving immediately, every muscle in my body tensing as I listened intently for any further sounds. My heart rate increased noticeably, and I became acutely aware of how alone and vulnerable I was in this remote location. The nearest human being was miles away, and no one would think to look for me if something went wrong. But this wasn't one of those moments you read about in horror stories where the forest went quiet and all natural sounds cease ominously. The birds were still active, though I noticed now that their calls seemed to be coming from the opposite direction, farther away from where the branch-breaking sound had originated. The insects continued their summer drone, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the faint rustle of a squirrel or chipmunk moving through the underbrush. What I didn't notice at the time, in my distracted state of grief and exhaustion, was that the birds had indeed changed their behavior. When I had first arrived at this spot, their calls had been all around me, a natural chorus that indicated a healthy, undisturbed ecosystem. Now their voices were coming from a completely different area, as if they had been driven away from something that made them uncomfortable. After sitting there for about 3 minutes, quietly looking around and trying to peer through the branches to my left, I didn't see anything that could have caused the sound. No movement, no flash of fur or feathers, no obvious explanation for the sharp crack I had heard. The forest seemed peaceful and normal, just as it had when I arrived. I convinced myself that it was probably just a dead branch finally giving way under its own weight, or perhaps a small animal that had moved on before I could spot it. The Adirondacks were full of wildlife, and it would be more unusual to spend hours in the woods without encountering some kind of animal activity. Satisfied with my rational explanation, I continued working to complete the burial. I finished covering the small grave, and then took time to mark it appropriately. I found several perfect pine cones in a smooth, rounded stone that had been polished by countless seasons of rain and snow. I arranged these natural markers in a small pattern that would indicate this spot was somehow different, somehow special, without being obvious to any casual passerby who might stumble across it. After I had completed the burial ritual and said my final prayer for the innocent creatures, I stood up slowly, my knees stiff from kneeling on the forest floor for so long. The work had been emotionally and physically draining, but I felt a sense of closure and peace. I had done what I could to restore some dignity to a situation that had begun with such cruelty. I brushed the dirt from my jeans and hands, shouldered my water bottle, and started to walk away from the great pine tree toward where I had left my supplies. The afternoon was advancing, and I still had several miles to cover before reaching the designated pickup point where Carlton would be waiting with the rest of the group. But as I took my first steps away from the burial site, I heard something that stopped me dead in my tracks and sent every primitive survival instinct in my body into high alert. It was a sound that could only be described as a moan mixed with a growl, low-pitched, prolonged, and unlike anything I had ever heard from the throat of any animal I was familiar with. The sound seemed to come from somewhere in the trees to my left, roughly in the same direction where I had heard the branch break earlier. This was bear country, and I knew that black bears could make a variety of vocalizations, from huffing and jaw-popping when stressed to loud bawling when cubs were separated from their mothers. There were also some cougars in the area, though they were much less common and typically avoided human contact. Mountain lions could produce some truly unsettling sounds, including screams that sounded almost human. My first instinct was that a natural predator had caught the scent of the recently buried remains and had come to investigate. The smell of death, even from small animals, could travel significant distances in the woods and attract scavengers from miles around. Bears especially had an incredible sense of smell and wouldn't hesitate to dig up a burial site if they thought there was an easy meal to be found. This thought made me acutely aware of how inadequately prepared I was for a potentially dangerous wildlife encounter. I had only my pocket knife as any form of self-defense, a pathetic weapon against a full-grown black bear or mountain lion. My heart began to pound as I realized just how isolated and vulnerable my situation had become. But even as these rational explanations ran through my mind, something about the sound bothered me in a way I couldn't articulate. I had spent countless hours in these woods over the years, and I had heard bears before. I had even encountered them on a few occasions and lived to tell about it. This sound was different somehow. It had a quality that didn't quite fit with any animal I knew. I wasn't really scared yet, though. My rational mind was still in control, and I was telling myself that it was probably just two trees rubbing against one another in the wind. That phenomenon was rather common in dense forest areas, especially when the wind picked up before a storm. The friction between bark and wood could create some truly bizarre sounds that might easily be mistaken for animal vocalizations. I stood perfectly still and scanned the forest around me, looking for any obvious signs of wildlife or any other explanation for what I had heard. The trees swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, and I could see several places where branches or trunks might be in contact with each other. The wind was picking up as the storm clouds I had noticed earlier began to move closer. Looking around carefully, I found nothing that could definitively explain the strange sound. The forest appeared normal and peaceful, with dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy and the usual summer symphony of insects and distant bird calls. But just as I was about to dismiss the incident and continue on my way back to civilization, something caught my eye that made my breath catch in my throat. About 30 yards away from the great pine tree where I had just completed the burial, I saw a branch and pieces of bark come falling down from a tree that was roughly half the size of the massive pine. The falling debris wasn't unusual in itself. Branches were constantly dropping in the forest as they died or were broken by wind and weather. But what made me look up into that tree would haunt my dreams for years to come. Midway up the trunk, perhaps 15 feet off the ground, I saw something that defied every category my rational mind tried to place it in. It appeared to be roughly the size of a bear cub, but everything else about it was wrong in ways that made my skin crawl and my pulse race. The thing was a mottled brown, gray-green color that seemed to shift and change as it moved against the bark of the tree. It had no obvious shape that I could compare to any animal I had ever seen or studied. The coloration and texture reminded me of lichen or moss, but there was an organic quality to it that clearly indicated this was a living creature, not some type of plant growth. Immediately I jumped backward, cursing loudly as I did so. The sudden movement and sound was involuntary. Every instinct in my body was screaming that what I was looking at was fundamentally wrong, even though I couldn't explain why. I turned around and took several more steps backward, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever that thing was, while still keeping my eyes locked on it. I couldn't tell if it was something alive or just some strange formation on the tree trunk. The pattern and coloration were so perfect for camouflage that it could have been part of the tree itself, some kind of growth or disease that I had never encountered before. But then it began to move, and there was no question that this was a living creature. The movement was subtle at first, just a slight shifting that made me realize the mass I was looking at was separate from the tree trunk. But as it became more active, I could see that it was definitely an animal of some kind, though unlike anything I had ever encountered in years of wilderness experience. Honestly, I still can't give you a clear description of what I saw that day. It didn't have fur like a bear or mountain lion, but it wasn't smooth skin either. The covering looked almost like living moss or lichen, textured and organic but somehow wrong. The closest comparison I can make is to say that it looked like the forest itself had somehow come alive and taken on a vaguely animal shape. As far as I knew, the Adirondacks didn't have anything like sloths. And even if they did, this thing didn't look like any sloth I had ever seen in nature documentaries. It was more compact and muscular, with a different body structure that seemed designed for climbing and clinging to vertical surfaces. I couldn't distinguish a head or face until it turned and looked directly at me. That moment when our eyes met across the 30 yards of forest floor was one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. It definitely had a face, but it was compressed and flattened in a way that didn't look natural for any mammal I could think of. I was standing roughly 80 feet from the creature, and it was positioned about 15 feet up the tree, which made getting clear details difficult. The day had turned mildly cloudy, and anyone who has spent time in deep woods knows that the canopy creates multiple layers of shade that can make even bright daylight seem dim and filtered. But even with the poor lighting conditions, I could make out enough details to know that this was unlike any animal I had ever encountered. The face appeared to be dark and compressed, almost as if it had been flattened against the front of the skull. I couldn't make out individual eyes or other facial features clearly, but there was definitely a sense of intelligence and awareness when it looked at me. What I could see clearly were the 4 limbs, which were wrapped around the tree trunk in a way that demonstrated incredible gripping strength. The appendages ended in what looked like paws, but they were more developed and dexterous than typical animal paws. They reminded me somewhat of raccoon hands, but the claws extending from them were proportionally much longer, about as long as the digits themselves. The creature also had a long, thick tail that was roughly the same length as its body. The tail moved occasionally, swishing back and forth in a way that seemed deliberate rather than reflexive. It was clearly being used for balance and support as the animal positioned itself on the tree trunk. As I watched in fascination and growing unease, the creature began to climb down the tree slowly and deliberately. Every movement was calculated and controlled, demonstrating a level of coordination and strength that was genuinely impressive. But throughout the entire descent, it kept its attention focused on me, watching me with an intensity that made me increasingly uncomfortable. This constant eye contact was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire encounter. Most wild animals, when they encounter humans, will either flee immediately or watch cautiously while preparing to flee. They don't typically maintain sustained eye contact while approaching closer to a potential threat. That's when I noticed something that made the encounter even more unsettling. The creature had ears that were soft and rounded, positioned on the sides of its head in a way that looked distinctly human rather than animal-like. Most mammals have ears that are pointed or elongated and positioned differently relative to their skull structure. These ears were wrong in a way that triggered some deep primitive part of my brain. The thing made no sound as it descended, except for the occasional light scraping of claws against bark. This silence was somehow more threatening than if it had been growling or making aggressive noises. The quiet deliberateness of its movement suggested intelligence and purpose rather than simple animal instinct. When it reached a large branch about 12 feet off the ground, it climbed out onto the limb with the same careful precision it had shown during its descent. The branch was substantial enough to support its weight, but I could see it flex slightly under the load, giving me some sense of how heavy this creature actually was. The thing moved like a raccoon in some ways, with that same fluid grace and obvious comfort in an arboreal environment. But the shape of the body and the proportions were all wrong. The rounded head seemed to have no obvious neck connecting directly to shoulders that were broader and more developed than any raccoon's. It wasn't a bear or any other animal I could think of, like a fisher or marten, because it had no protruding snout. The face was compressed and flattened, with what appeared to be nostril holes rather than any obvious nose structure. The overall facial configuration was vaguely reminiscent of certain primate species, but there were no known monkeys or apes native to North America. Its eyes were a lighter color that caught and reflected the available sunlight on occasion, giving them an almost luminous quality in the shadows of the forest canopy. When the light hit them just right, they seemed to glow with their own internal illumination, which added to the otherworldly quality of the entire encounter. The skin or covering looked like it could serve as perfect camouflage, blending seamlessly with tree bark, moss-covered rocks, or forest floor debris. In different lighting or from a greater distance, this creature could probably become nearly invisible in its natural environment. Suddenly, the creature opened its mouth and let out a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a low-pitched whistle, unlike anything I had ever heard from any animal. The sound was pure and sustained, almost musical in quality, but there was something profoundly unsettling about it that bypassed my rational mind and spoke directly to some primal fear center in my brain. The whistle seemed to go on forever, though it was probably only a few seconds. During that time, I felt completely frozen, unable to move or think clearly. It was as if the sound had some kind of hypnotic or paralyzing effect that temporarily short-circuited my normal responses. That's when I decided I'd seen more than enough. Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get away from this creature as quickly as possible. Whatever it was, it clearly wasn't afraid of humans, and its behavior suggested a level of intelligence and curiosity that made me deeply uncomfortable. I glanced backward quickly to make sure my escape path was clear of obstacles, then turned and ran through the forest as fast as the terrain would allow. Branches whipped at my face and arms, and I stumbled several times on hidden roots and fallen logs, but I didn't slow down until I was completely out of breath. I looked back several times during my panicked flight to make sure I wasn't being followed. The creature never pursued me, which was both a relief and somehow even more disturbing. Most animals that might pose a threat would either chase prey or retreat from a potential threat. This thing just watched me go with what seemed like mild interest, as if my presence had been entertaining but not particularly important. When I finally stopped running, I was completely lost and disoriented. In my panic, I had abandoned any attempt to navigate carefully, and I now had no idea which direction would lead me back to my supplies or to the pickup point where Carlton would be waiting. It took me nearly 2 hours of careful navigation using the sun's position and my knowledge of the local topography to find my way back to where I had left my equipment. By the time I retrieved my backpack and poke stick, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and emotionally drained from the entire experience. I never did see the creature again during my remaining time in the woods that day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still somewhere nearby, watching me from a distance. Every shadow seemed potentially threatening. Every sound made me jump, and I found myself constantly looking up into the trees for any sign of movement. When I finally made it to the pickup point, Carlton took one look at me and knew something significant had happened. I was scratched, dirty, and obviously shaken, and I had very little to show for an entire day of cleanup work. I told him about finding the dead puppies and taking time to bury them, which he approved of and understood. But when I described the creature I had encountered, his expression became skeptical and concerned. "Probably a raccoon with mange," he said after I had finished my account. "Mange can make animals look pretty strange, change their behavior too. They lose their fur, get disoriented, sometimes become more aggressive or less afraid of humans." When I insisted that the face didn't look like any raccoon I'd ever seen, he suggested that stress and adrenaline had affected my perception. "When you're scared and alone in the woods, your mind can play tricks on you," he explained. "Things that are perfectly normal can seem strange and threatening, But I knew what I had seen, and I knew it wasn't a diseased raccoon, or a trick of light and shadow. The creature's face had been similar to that of certain primate species I'd seen in nature documentaries, broad and flattened like a snub-nosed monkey. But the color, proportions, and overall appearance were completely different from any known primate. There are no native monkey species in North America, and this was far too remote an area for an escaped exotic pet to survive for any length of time. The nearest zoo was hundreds of miles away, and there had been no reports of missing animals that matched what I had described. I don't have a definitive answer to what I saw that day, and I've spent years researching it on and off without finding any satisfactory explanation. It was clearly comfortable climbing trees and living in an arboreal environment, with adaptations that were perfectly suited for life in the forest canopy. But more than the physical characteristics, it was the intelligence and awareness that the creature displayed that continues to disturb me. The way it watched me, the deliberate nature of its movements, the strange whistle that seemed almost like an attempt at communication. All of these behaviors suggested something far more complex than a simple woodland animal. To this day, whenever I'm in the woods, I find myself looking up into the trees more often than I used to. Not out of fear, exactly, but out of a heightened awareness that there might be things living in our forests that we don't know about or understand. Things that are perfectly adapted to remain hidden from human observation, emerging only occasionally when circumstances align in just the right way. I still love the wilderness, and I still spend as much time as possible in wild places. But that encounter changed my relationship with the forest in subtle but lasting ways. I'm more alert now, more aware of the possibility that we might not be alone even in the most remote locations. Sometimes when I'm camping alone and I hear an unusual sound in the darkness beyond my fire, I remember that low-pitched whistle and wonder if somewhere out there, in the deep woods where humans rarely venture, there are creatures that have learned to live alongside us without our knowledge. The question that haunts me most isn't what I saw that day. It's how many other people have had similar encounters and simply never talked about them, knowing that no one would believe their stories or take them seriously. In the end, perhaps Carlton was right, and stress and isolation affected my perception of a perfectly ordinary animal. But deep down, I know what I experienced was real, and I know it was something that doesn't fit into any of our neat categories of known wildlife. The Adirondacks are vast and largely unexplored, containing millions of acres of wilderness that humans visit only rarely. If something wanted to remain hidden in such an environment, it would have countless opportunities to do so. And maybe that's exactly what's happening. Maybe there are creatures living in our forests that have evolved not just to survive in the wild, but to avoid detection by the species that has claimed dominion over the rest of the planet. Whatever I saw that day, it was perfectly adapted to its environment and showed no fear of humans. It was curious about me, but not threatened by my presence. And that, more than anything else, is what continues to give me pause when I venture into the deep woods alone. Because if there are things out there that we don't know about, things that are intelligent enough to remain hidden from us, then we need to be more humble about our assumption that we understand and control the natural world around us. The wilderness still holds secrets, and some of those secrets might be more profound and disturbing than we're prepared to acknowledge. As I zipped up my backpack filled with enough supplies for a week-long camping trip in the Navajo Nation's rugged backcountry, I couldn't shake the feeling that this excursion would be different from any I'd experienced before. My name is Alex, and I've always been drawn to the untamed wilderness, seeking solace in nature's embrace. But this time, something in the air felt charged, electric with anticipation, or perhaps warning. The Navajo Reservation sprawled across the Four Corners region, a vast expanse of red rock canyons, pine-forested mountains, and sacred lands steeped in ancient lore. I'd obtained the necessary permits and studied the approved hiking routes, determined to respect the land and its people. Yet as I shouldered my pack and locked my car at the trailhead, a chill ran down my spine despite the warm autumn sun. I set off down the well-worn path, boots crunching on gravel and pine needles. The scent of sage and juniper filled my nostrils, and the distant cry of a hawk echoed through the canyons. As I hiked deeper into the wilderness, the modern world fell away, replaced by a landscape that seemed unchanged for millennia. By late afternoon, I'd covered several miles and decided to make camp in a small clearing nestled between towering ponderosa pines. As I set up my tent and gathered firewood, the shadows lengthened, and an eerie stillness settled over the forest. The usual chorus of birdsong and rustling leaves had gone quiet, as if the very land was holding its breath. I cooked a simple meal over my campfire, watching as the flames cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. As night fell, a sliver of moon rose, bathing the landscape in pale, silvery light. I should have felt at peace, but instead, unease gnawed at the pit of my stomach. Just as I was about to retreat to my tent, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond the firelight. I froze, straining my ears. Another crack, closer this time. My heart began to race as I peered into the gloom, searching for the source of the sound. Then I saw it, a pair of eyes reflecting the firelight, too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal. They blinked once and vanished. I scrambled into my tent, zipping it shut as if the thin nylon could offer any real protection. Sleep eluded me that night, my mind racing with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world and the supernatural forces that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. Dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. I emerged from my tent, bleary-eyed and on edge after a restless night. The forest seemed normal in the light of day, birds chirping and small animals scurrying about their business. I tried to convince myself that the eyes I'd seen were just a figment of my imagination, a trick of shadow and firelight. As I broke camp and continued my hike, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow that flickered at the corner of my vision, set my nerves on edge. I pressed on, following the trail as it wound through a narrow canyon, red rock walls towering on either side. Midday found me resting beside a small stream, refilling my water bottles and stretching my tired muscles. As I sat on a sun-warmed boulder, letting the gentle burble of the water soothe my frayed nerves, an old man appeared on the path. He was clearly Navajo, his weathered face etched with the lines of a long life, his long silver hair tied back in a neat braid. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said without preamble, his dark eyes studying me intently. I started, surprised by his sudden appearance. "I have a permit," I replied defensively. "I'm following all the guidelines for backcountry hiking." The old man shook his head slowly. "Some things can't be permitted. Some trails shouldn't be walked by outsiders." He paused, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Have you seen anything unusual?" I hesitated, then found myself telling him about the eyes I'd glimpsed the night before. As I spoke, the old man's expression grew grave. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You've entered a place between worlds, where the veil is thin. There are creatures here, ancient and powerful, that don't take kindly to trespassers." "What kind of creatures?" I asked, a chill creeping up my spine despite the warm sun. The old man's eyes met mine, and in them I saw a mixture of fear and resignation. "We call them Yinaldlushi, skinwalkers. They are witches who have forsaken their humanity, taking on the forms of animals to work their evil." I wanted to scoff, to dismiss his words as superstition, but the memory of those gleaming eyes in the darkness held my tongue. "How can I protect myself?" I asked instead. The old man reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew a small object, a hand-carved fetish in the shape of a wolf, strung on a leather cord. "Wear this," he said, pressing it into my hand. "It may offer some protection, but the surest safety lies in leaving this place. Turn back while you still can." Before I could reply, he turned and walked away, disappearing around a bend in the canyon as suddenly as he had appeared. I stared at the fetish in my hand, its weight seeming far greater than its size would suggest. As I resumed my hike, the old man's warnings echoed in my mind. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss them as the ramblings of a superstitious elder, but a deeper instinct urged caution. I slipped the fetish around my neck, its presence both comforting and ominous. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but as twilight approached and I made camp for the second night, the forest seemed to close in around me. The shadows grew longer, darker, and more menacing. As I huddled by my small fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there in the darkness, watching, waiting. Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with disjointed nightmares. Flashes of teeth and claws, inhuman howls, and always, always those gleaming eyes boring into my soul. I awoke with a start, heart pounding, sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool night air. Something had pulled me from my uneasy slumber. A sound, barely perceptible but undeniably real. I lay still in my sleeping bag, ears straining in the darkness. There it was again, a soft scraping, like claws on bark, coming from just outside my tent. My fingers clutched the wolf fetish around my neck as I held my breath, willing whatever was out there to move on. A shadow fell across the tent wall, backlit by the dying embers of my fire. It was distinctly humanoid in shape, but too tall, too lean to be a normal person. As I watched in paralyzed horror, the shadow seemed to elongate, twisting into something no longer recognizably human. A low growl rumbled through the night, so deep I felt it in my bones rather than heard it. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. The scraping sounds receded, fading into the distance until all I could hear was the frantic pounding of my own heart. I didn't sleep again that night. As soon as the first gray light of dawn seeped through the trees, I emerged from my tent on shaky legs. The campsite looked undisturbed, but as I circled the perimeter, I froze in my tracks. There, in a patch of soft earth, was a footprint, if you could call it that. It was elongated, with sharp claw marks at the ends of distorted toes. It looked like a bizarre fusion of human and animal, too large for a wolf or coyote, but no human foot could have made that impression. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Could it be a bear? A mountain lion? But I knew in my gut that this was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist in the natural world. As I stared at the track, the old man's words came back to me. Yinald Lushi, skinwalkers. I shuddered, the weight of the fetish around my neck suddenly oppressive. I broke camp in record time, my earlier plans of a leisurely week-long trek forgotten. All I wanted now was to get back to civilization, back to a world where monsters existed only in stories and on screens. But as I shouldered my pack and consulted my map, my heart sank. The quickest route back to my car was still a 2-day hike through increasingly rugged terrain. I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves. I could do this. I had to do this. I set off at a brisk pace, constantly scanning my surroundings. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. By midday, my nerves were frayed, and my muscles ached from the constant tension. As I paused to rest and eat a quick lunch, movement caught my eye. About 50 yards away, partially obscured by a stand of junipers, stood a coyote. But something was off. Its proportions were wrong, its limbs too long, its posture too erect. As I stared, it turned its head and met my gaze. Those eyes, they were the same ones I'd seen that first night, glowing in the firelight. They weren't the eyes of an animal, but something ancient, intelligent and malevolent. A sound escaped its mouth, not the yip of a coyote, but a low guttural laugh that was terrifyingly human. I scrambled to my feet, abandoning my half-eaten lunch, and ran. I crashed through underbrush, leapt over fallen logs, my pack bouncing painfully against my back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled, finally collapsing against a boulder, gasping for air. As my breathing slowed and my panic subsided, I realized I had a bigger problem. In my blind flight, I'd veered off the trail. I was lost in the wilderness, with dusk approaching and something inhuman on my trail. I pulled out my map and compass with shaking hands, trying to get my bearings. But as the shadows lengthened and an unnatural mist began to creep through the trees, I knew that this night would be a fight for survival, and quite possibly for my very soul. As twilight deepened into true night, an unnatural fog rolled through the forest, thick and cloying. It seemed to absorb sound and light, leaving me in a muffled gray world where distances became deceptive and familiar landmarks disappeared into the gloom. I had managed to find a small cave in the side of a rocky outcropping. Not much more than a shallow indent, really, but it felt safer than being fully exposed. I huddled there, my back pressed against the cold stone, straining my eyes and ears for any sign of pursuit. The mist swirled and eddied, taking on shapes that seemed almost deliberate, reaching tendrils, grasping claws, leering faces that formed and dissolved in the blink of an eye. I told myself it was just my frightened imagination playing tricks, but a deeper part of me knew better. This fog wasn't natural. It was a hunting ground, a veil between worlds where the skinwalker held sway. As if summoned by my thoughts, a howl pierced the night. A sound that started as a wolf's cry but twisted mid-note into something terrifyingly human. It was close, much too close. I pressed myself further into the meager shelter of the cave, one hand clutching the wolf fetish, the other wrapped around the handle of my hunting knife. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. Through the mist, a figure began to take shape. At first, it looked like a man, tall and lean, but as it drew closer, its form seemed to shimmer and shift. One moment it was bipedal, the next it moved on all fours. Its proportions changed with each step, limbs elongating, spine twisting, head reshaping itself from human to animal, and back again. I held my breath, hoping against hope that it would pass me by. The figure paused, lifting its head to scent the air. Slowly it turned toward my hiding place. Through the fog I caught a glimpse of its face, a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with eyes that glowed with an inner fire. It spoke then in a voice that grated like stone on stone. "I smell your fear, little one. You don't belong here. This is my domain, my hunting ground. Did you think that trinket would protect you?" I clutched the fetish tighter, my voice barely a whisper as I replied, "What do you want from me?" The creature's mouth stretched into a grotesque parody of a smile, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Want. I want what all predators want. The thrill of the chase, the taste of terror, the satisfaction of a successful hunt. It took a step closer, its form rippling and changing. "But you're different. I sense power in you, untapped potential. You could join us, you know? Shed your frail human form, embrace the night, become something more." For a moment, just a moment, I felt a pull, a seductive whisper of power and freedom. But then I thought of home, of my family and friends, of the life I'd left behind. I gripped the fetish so hard its edges bit into my palm. "Never," I spat, surprising myself with the vehemence in my voice. The skinwalker's eyes narrowed, and a low growl rumbled from its chest. "Then you've chosen to remain prey. Run, little one. Run as fast and as far as you can. It will make the hunt all the sweeter." With that, it melted back into the mist, its laughter echoing through the trees. I remained frozen in place for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe too loudly. But as the eastern sky began to lighten, I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to move, had to find my way back to the trail, and ultimately to safety. As I cautiously emerged from my shelter, the mist began to dissipate, revealing a landscape transformed by night. Everywhere I looked, I saw signs of the skinwalker's presence, claw marks on trees, tufts of fur that were neither fully animal nor human, tracks that shifted from paw prints to footprints and back again. I consulted my map and compass, plotted what I hoped was a course back to the main trail, and set off. But with each step I knew the skinwalker was out there, watching, waiting for night to fall again. And I knew that when darkness came, the real hunt would begin. As I pushed on through the day, trying to make up for lost time and find my way back to the marked trail, the weight of history and myth seemed to press in around me. Every rock formation, every ancient tree felt imbued with significance I couldn't quite grasp. Exhaustion and fear had heightened my senses to a fever pitch. Colors seemed more vivid, scents more potent, and as I walked I began to hear whispers. At first I thought it was just the wind through the leaves or my own ragged breathing. But gradually the whispers coalesced into words, fragments of stories, warnings, laments. They spoke of ancient wars between tribes, of dark magic and terrible sacrifices. They told of the first skinwalkers, medicine men, and women who had twisted their healing arts to serve their own selfish ends, trading their humanity for power. I heard tales of entire villages wiped out in a single night, of children stolen from their beds, of a darkness that had haunted these lands for centuries. As the whispers grew louder, the landscape around me seemed to shift and change. One moment I was walking through the forest as it was. The next I was surrounded by the ghostly images of a past long gone. I saw native warriors locked in battle, their war cries echoing across time. I witnessed secret ceremonies in hidden caves, where aspiring skinwalkers performed unspeakable rites to gain their powers. Through it all, one name kept repeating, growing louder until it drowned out all other sounds. Nahokoshi Hastiin, man who devours the stars. The visions crescendoed, and suddenly I found myself in the midst of a nightmarish scene. A village was burning, its inhabitants fleeing in terror as a monstrous figure loped between the flames. It was larger than any skinwalker I'd seen or imagined, its form a horrifying amalgamation of wolf, bear, and man. Its eyes blazed with an unholy fire as it snatched up fleeing villagers, consuming them whole. As quickly as it had appeared, the vision faded, leaving me gasping and disoriented. I stumbled, nearly falling, and found myself face to face with a weathered petroglyph carved into a red rock wall. The crude figure depicted matched the monster from my vision, Nahokoshi Hastian, the most powerful and terrifying skinwalker of all. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the truth. I wasn't just being hunted by any skinwalker. I had stumbled into the territory of a legendary evil, a creature that had terrorized these lands for untold generations. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, I redoubled my efforts to find the trail. The whispers faded, but the knowledge they had imparted weighed heavily on me. I was no longer just fighting for my own survival, but carrying the echoes of countless victims before me. Their stories, their warnings, their pain, all of it fueled my determination to survive and somehow put an end to this ancient evil. As night fell once more, I knew I couldn't keep running. The skinwalker, Nahokoshi Hastian, would never stop hunting me, and even if I managed to escape, how many more innocent lives would be lost to this monster? The whispers of the past had awakened something in me, a sense of responsibility I couldn't ignore. I found a defensible position, a small plateau with a clear view of the surrounding area. Instead of hiding, I built a fire, larger than was wise, a blazing beacon in the darkness. Then I sat, the wolf fetish in one hand, my knife in the other, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. The mist rolled in once more, but this time I was ready for it. I focused on the fetish, remembering the old man's words, drawing strength from the generations of Navajo who had fought against this evil before me. A howl split the night, closer than ever before. I stood, facing the direction of the sound. "I'm here," I shouted into the darkness. "Come and face me, Nahokoshi Hastian. I'm not running anymore." The mist parted, and there it stood, the monster from my vision. Even more terrifying in reality. It towered over me, its massive form rippling with barely contained power, its eyes fixed on me, burning with hunger and hatred. "Brave little morsel," it growled, its voice like grinding boulders. "Do you think you can stand against me? Countless warriors have tried. Their bones litter my domain." I stood my ground, fear warring with determination. Maybe they stood alone, but I carry their stories, their strength. I won't let their sacrifices be in vain. The skinwalker laughed, a sound that shook the very ground. "Pretty words. Let's see if they protect you from my claws and teeth." It lunged, faster than anything that size should move. But somehow, I was faster. I dodged, the fetish in my hand growing warm. Was it my imagination? Or was it glowing faint? We danced a deadly dance, the skinwalker's massive form twisting and changing as it attacked. One moment it had the head of a wolf, the next a bear's crushing paws. I dodged and weaved, the fetish growing hotter in my hand, seeming to guide my movements. As we fought, I began to understand. The skinwalker's power came from fear, the fear of its victims, the fear it had instilled in these lands for generations. And while I was terrified, I was no longer letting that fear control me. "Your time is over, Nahokoshi Hastian," I shouted, my voice stronger than I felt. "These lands don't belong to you anymore." The skinwalker roared in fury, lunging at me with renewed ferocity. But in its anger, it grew careless. I saw an opening and took it, driving my knife deep into its side. The creature howled in pain and rage. Black, oily blood seeped from the wound. It staggered back, its form flickering like a bad transmission. "This isn't over," it snarled. "I am eternal. I am the night itself." But I could see the truth in its eyes. For the first time in centuries, Nahokoshi Hastian knew fear. Before I could press my advantage, the skinwalker melted into the mist, its howls fading into the distance. I stood there, breathing hard, hardly believing I had survived. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion hit me like a truck. I barely managed to rekindle my fire before collapsing beside it, slipping into a deep, dreamless sleep. I awoke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the trees. For a moment I lay there, disoriented, the events of the night before feeling like a distant nightmare. But the ache in my muscles and the dried blood on my knife told a different story. As I sat up, wincing at my various scrapes and bruises, I noticed something had changed. The air felt lighter, cleaner somehow. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the forest was gone, replaced by the normal sounds of birds and small animals going about their morning routines. I broke camp quickly, eager to find my way back to civilization. As I hiked, I remained alert, half expecting the skinwalker to launch another attack. But the day passed uneventfully, the beauty of the wilderness slowly working its way back into my awareness. By mid-afternoon, I finally spotted a familiar landmark, a distinctive rock formation I recognized from my map. I was back on the main trail, and not far from the trailhead where I'd left my car. As I rounded a bend in the path, I nearly ran into someone coming the other way. It was the old Navajo man who had given me the fetish. He smiled at me, but it was a smile tinged with sadness, and something else, respect, perhaps. "You faced him," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, suddenly at a loss for words. How could I possibly explain what had happened? The old man's eyes crinkled at the corners. "You did well. Nahukoji Hastian's power is broken. At least for now. It will be many years before he troubles these lands again." "But I didn't kill it," I protested. "It got away. Some evils can't be killed, only pushed back," the old man replied. "What matters is that you stood against the darkness. You reminded it that there are still those who will fight." He reached out, gently taking the wolf fetish from around my neck. "This has served its purpose. I'll see that it's properly honored." As he turned to go, I called out, "Wait, who are you? How did you know about all this?" The old man paused, looking back at me with eyes that suddenly seemed ancient and unfathomably deep. "I am a guardian, one of many. We watch, we wait, we prepare others to face the darkness when it rises." His form shimmered slightly, reminding me of the skinwalker's transformations, but without the sense of wrongness. "Safe journey, brave one. And should you ever return to these lands, know that you walk among friends." With that, he disappeared around a bend in the trail. When I hurried after him, there was no sign of his passing. The final miles back to my car passed in a daze. My encounter with the skinwalker, the visions of the past, the mysterious old man, it all swirled in my mind, too fantastical to be real, yet impossible to dismiss. As I drove away from the Navajo lands, heading back toward the familiar comforts of home, I found myself grappling with everything I'd experienced. How could I possibly explain it to anyone? Who would believe me? But as the miles rolled by, I realized that maybe I didn't need anyone else to believe. I knew what had happened. I had faced an ancient evil, and against all odds I had survived. More than that, I had struck a blow against a darkness that had plagued these lands for generations. The experience had changed me, opened my eyes to a world beyond the one I thought I knew. I found myself looking at the landscape differently, wondering what other secrets it held, what other guardians watched from the shadows. As I neared home, I made a decision. I would return someday, better prepared, with a deeper understanding of the lore and history of these lands. The skinwalker was wounded but not destroyed, and if it ever rose again, I wanted to be ready. For now, though, I longed for the comfort of familiar surroundings. As I pulled into my driveway, the first stars appearing in the twilight sky, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. I had walked in two worlds and returned to tell the tale. I knew that my nights would be haunted for some time to come, filled with dreams of mist-shrouded forests and gleaming eyes in the darkness. But I also knew that I was stronger for having faced my fears, for having stood against an evil most could never imagine. As I unlocked my front door, I paused, looking back at the distant silhouette of mountains on the horizon. "Until we meet again," I whispered to the wind, to the ancient lands, to the guardians who walked unseen. Then I stepped inside, closing the door on one chapter of my life and opening another. The world was bigger, stranger, and more wondrous than I had ever imagined. And somewhere out there, in the wild places where few dare to tread, the eternal dance between light and darkness continued, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to join in. It was supposed to be a fun summer camping trip with my two best friends, John and Tyler. We had been planning it for months, a week out in the woods of northern Arizona, hiking, telling stories around the campfire, and getting away from it all. Little did we know the terror that awaited us. We arrived at the trailhead on a hot July afternoon and hefted our heavy packs onto our backs. The air smelled of sun-baked pine needles. Excited for the adventure ahead, we set off down the dusty trail, which quickly narrowed and plunged into a dense forest of ponderosa pines and Douglas firs. The trail wound through the trees, steadily climbing upwards. Occasionally, shafts of sunlight would pierce through the thick canopy, illuminating the motes of pollen and dust swirling in the still air. After a few hours of hiking, we reached a small clearing near a stream and decided to set up camp for the night. We pitched our tents, gathered firewood, and as dusk fell, built a roaring campfire. The crackling flames cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees as we cooked up some hot dogs and beans for dinner. "Did you hear about the skinwalkers that supposedly live in these woods?" Tyler asked, his face flickering in the firelight. John and I shook our heads. "Skinwalkers are these creatures from Navajo legends," Tyler continued in a hushed voice. "Shamans who can transform into animals, like coyotes or owls. But they're evil. They use their powers to curse and hurt people." "Come on, man. That's just a myth," scoffed John, tossing another log on the fire. But I felt a chill run down my spine, and it wasn't from the cool night air. My grandfather had told me stories about skinwalkers when I was a kid, tales passed down from his own Navajo grandfather. I had always dismissed them as just spooky legends, but out here in the vast wilderness, miles from civilization, those old stories took on a menacing weight. We stayed up late into the night, swapping more creepy tales around the dying embers of the fire. Finally, we doused the coals and retired to our tents. But sleep did not come easy to me. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me start. At one point, I could have sworn I heard footsteps padding softly around our tents, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. My heart pounded in my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut and eventually drifted off into a fitful sleep, plagued by strange and unsettling dreams. I awoke with a start. Something had woken me. A sound. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, straining my ears to listen. Beside me, John and Tyler slept on, their breathing slow and even. There it was again. A low, mournful howl that made the hairs on my arms stand up. It sounded like a wolf, but distorted somehow, tinged with an almost human-like anguish. And it sounded close, maybe just beyond the edge of our campsite. I fumbled for my flashlight with shaking hands and unzipped the tent flap as slowly and quietly as I could. I poked my head out, heart pounding, and swept the beam of my flashlight across the campsite. The clearing was empty, our tents and supplies undisturbed. But as I panned the light towards the trees, I froze. Two eyes glowed back at me from the underbrush, about 30 yards away. They were the color of molten sulfur, flickering with a feral, otherworldly light. The howl sounded again, raising in pitch and intensity until it became an almost deafening shriek that shook me to my core. Those baleful yellow eyes never wavered from me. I tore my gaze away and scrambled back into the tent, zipping it up tight with fumbling fingers. I huddled in my sleeping bag, trembling, too terrified to even call out to my friends. The shrieks and howls continued, moving around and around our campsite in a dizzying spiral. It sounded like a coyote, an owl, a woman screaming, all at once, blending and bleeding into each other. This went on for what felt like hours, though it may have only been minutes. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop, trying to convince myself it was only a nightmare. Eventually, blessedly, the noises faded away, and the woods fell silent once more. I must have dozed off at some point, more from sheer exhaustion than anything else. I awoke at first light to John shaking my shoulder. "Rise and shine, sleeping beauty," he said with a grin. "You look like hell. Did you sleep at all last night?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I begin to explain the sheer primal dread I had experienced? I shook my head and mumbled something about weird dreams. Over breakfast, I kept glancing over my shoulder at the spot in the trees where I had seen those burning yellow eyes. But in the light of day, the forest looked entirely ordinary, even inviting. I started to wonder if I really had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just my overactive imagination, primed by Tyler's skinwalker stories conjuring phantom terrors in the night. After breaking camp, we decided to spend the day going on a longer hike to explore more of the area. I've heard there are some wicked cool caves a few miles north of here, Tyler said, consulting his trail map. I felt a flicker of unease at the thought of venturing even deeper into the trackless wilderness. But not wanting to seem like a chicken in front of my friends, I agreed. We refilled our water bottles in the creek, shouldered our day packs, and set off. It was a hard hike. The trail grew steeper and rockier, winding up through a parched, sun-blasted landscape of red sandstone cliffs and gnarled juniper trees. The relentless July sun beat down on us, and I could feel my shirt sticking to my back with sweat. We spoke little, saving our breath for the climb. As the afternoon wore on, an oppressive silence seemed to fall over the land, broken only by the crunch of our footsteps and the hollow whistle of the wind through the canyons. I had the uncanny sensation of being watched, though I never saw another soul on the trail. We reached the caves by late afternoon, a series of shadowy openings set into a sheer cliff face, a welcome relief from the heat of the day. A faint, musty smell wafted out, tinged with something sharper underneath that I couldn't place. Tyler produced a handful of glow sticks from his pack, and we each took one, snapping them to life. An eerie green light filled the mouth of the largest cave as we ducked inside, the air instantly cooling around us. Our glow sticks threw distorted, bobbing shadows on the rock walls as we moved deeper into the gloom. "Whoa, check these out," John called. He was crouched at the base of the wall a little ways in. As I drew closer, I saw what he was pointing at. A series of crude paintings etched into the stone. Stick figure men and animals danced across the rock, but there was something off about them. The proportions were all wrong, the limbs too long and spindly, the faces little more than gaping black holes. One figure in particular drew my eye. A towering man shape with the head of a coyote, its jaws stretched wide in a silent howl. Something about it sent a spike of primal fear lancing through me. As I leaned in closer to look, my foot hit something that made a hollow clinking sound. I glanced down to see that I had kicked a small object out of the dust and gravel on the cave floor. I stooped to pick it up. It was some sort of talisman or fetish, a thing of knotted twigs and bits of bone and yellowed teeth, all bound together with scraps of sinew, and in the center, a large oval stone with a hole worn through it. It almost looked like an eye, and unless it was a trick of the strange light, it almost seemed to be gleaming with a faint inner glow. A sudden dizziness washed over me, and I swayed on my feet. It felt as though the air had grown thick and hard to breathe. Without thinking, I slipped the unnerving object into my pocket. I just wanted to get out of this cave, with its eerie paintings and stifling atmosphere. "Come on, let's keep going," I called ahead to Tyler and John, wincing at the high, thready note in my voice. They looked up from the paintings and nodded, and together we pressed on into the tunnel's inky depths, our meager lights swallowed by the choking blackness. The deeper we pushed into the tangled guts of the cave system, the more uneasy I became. The passages twisted and turned, splitting off into side tunnels that gaped like hungry mouths. More than once I was sure we had gotten turned around and were going in circles. The air felt increasingly thick and stale, and I found myself panting for breath. My heart thudded against my ribs and my palms were slick with cold sweat. That strange dizziness from earlier still hadn't abated. "Does something feel off to you guys?" John asked, his voice echoing queerly in the confined space. "I don't like this place. I think we should turn back." "Don't be such a pussy," Tyler scoffed, though I noticed a tremor under his bravado.
"These caves probably go on for miles. I bet we barely scratched the surface."
I was just about to suggest that maybe John was right, that we should call it a day, when Tyler's glow stick winked out, plunging his section of tunnel into inky blackness. A startled curse rang out. "Shit. Guys, I'm out of glow sticks. I can't see a thing," Tyler called, a rising note of panic in his voice. "Where are you?" "Right here, we're coming. Just stay put," John replied. I could hear him scuffling cautiously forward in the darkness towards Tyler. I swept my own fading glow stick in a wide arc, trying to get my bearings. As I did, the light flared over a craggy side passage a few yards ahead of me. I hadn't noticed it before, but it looked bigger than the others, tall enough to stand in. A flicker of movement from within caught my eye. Or did I imagine it? I took a few steps closer, heart pounding. My dwindling light played over the jagged rock walls. There was a sharp bend in the passage, hiding the depths from view. As my eyes strained to pierce the gloom, a figure suddenly detached itself from the shadows beyond and glided forward. My breath seized in my throat. It was tall, skeletally thin, little more than a silhouette in the darkness, but I caught the gleam of teeth bared in a feral grin, the glint of reptilian eyes, before the light sputtered and died, plunging me into Stygian blackness. A wave of sheer atavistic terror crashed over me. I screamed and spun away blindly, scrabbling back down the tunnel towards my friends. I could hear them yelling my name. I collided with them in the pitch dark, babbling in mindless panic. Together we fled through the labyrinthine dark, bouncing off unseen walls, tripping over stones, utterly lost. Finally, blessedly, I caught a whiff of fresher air and charged toward it like a crazed thing. We burst out of the caves into the fire-red light of sunset, gulping the warm evening air in great sobbing gasps. I collapsed to my knees in the dirt, my whole body shaking as if with a greg. "What the hell happened back there?" demanded John, his face bone white. I just shook my head wordlessly, unable to give voice to the raw dread choking my throat. Had the terror in the dark caverns been real, or a figment of my increasingly unhinged mind? I couldn't be sure of anything anymore. The hike back to camp was a tense, silent affair. We skipped dinner, too shaken to have any appetite. I lay in my tent, staring at the canvas wall, the talisman I'd found burning a hole in my pocket. I was too afraid to even take it out and look at it again. At some point, I lapsed into a thin, troubled sleep. Visions of reptilian eyes and fang-filled grins cavorted behind my eyelids. I startled awake in the gray pre-dawn light, my sleeping bag tangled around my sweat-soaked limbs. Crawling out of the tent, I stood up painfully, muscles sore and joints aching like I had aged decades in a single night. As I turned to survey the gloom-shrouded campsite, my heart stuttered to a stop. There, at the edge of the clearing, just visible through the shifting curtains of mist, a tall, spindly silhouette, its form wavering and blurring like a mirage. Even at this distance, I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, twin points of baleful phosphorescent green. It raised one emaciated arm, a single skeletal finger pointed directly at me. Then, between one blink and the next, it was gone, dissolving into the murk as if it had never been. We broke camp in record time, not speaking a word to each other. I think by that point we all just wanted to get the hell out of those woods as quickly as possible. But I felt like a marked man stumbling through a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. As we set off down the trail, packs heavy on our aching backs, the feeling of being watched returned tenfold. The shadows between the trees seemed to ripple and seethe, snap of twig and rustle of leaves from unseen things tracking us just out of sight. And always at the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement, a flash of unnatural contortions, there and gone. We had been hiking for maybe 20 minutes when Tyler, who was on point, suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his face bloodless. John and I cocked our heads, listening, and then we heard it too, a voice on the wind. Ragged, ululating syllables in some unknown tongue, ebbing and flowing, drawing closer. "Run," John croaked. "Run." And we ran, crashing through the brush in a blind frenzy, heedless of direction. Brambles tore at our clothes, lashed our faces. Behind us, the eerie chanting swelled, the words resolving into an all-too-clear refrain, "My stone, return my stone." With a sinking feeling of dread, I remembered the talisman from the cave, still jammed in the pocket of my jeans. The skinwalker's fetish, its power token, and I had taken it. Abruptly, the trees fell away and we stumbled to a halt, gasping for air. We had burst out into a small meadow, a still glade dappled with late afternoon sunlight, but the space had an expectant hush, like an audience holding its breath before the show begins. As we milled about wildly, unsure which way to turn, a figure emerged from the trees at the far side of the meadow. My blood turned to ice in my veins. It was the silhouette from the campsite, from the cave, but in the full light of day, its true nature was laid bare, and it was so much worse than I could have ever imagined. Emaciated to the point of skeletal, its ash-gray skin was stretched drum-tight over jutting bones, knobby stick limbs, long, scabrous fingers tipped in barbed nails. Rags fluttered from its body, rank with filth and rot. But the face was the true horror. A coyote's narrow muzzle, studded with jagged, mismatched teeth jammed too closely in a distended human jawbone. Pointed, attentive ears twitching spasmodically, bile-green eyes blazing with malice and sinister intelligence from underneath a heavy brow ridge. An abomination of nature, a mockery of all things right and good. "You have something of mine," it spoke, its voice the dry rasp of scales over stone. "Return it now, and I will grant you a merciful death." I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot with terror. Tyler and John looked to me in mounting horror, realizing that I was the reason this thing had stalked and tormented us. With a trembling hand, I reached into my pocket, pulled out that wretched talisman. As soon as it hit the open air, it began to vibrate, to hum, as if in recognition of its master. The skinwalkers, as soon as the talisman hit the open air, it began to vibrate, to hum, as if in recognition of its master. The skinwalker's phosphorescent eyes fastened hungrily upon it. "Yes," it hissed, a long forked tongue lolling obscenely over its snaggle teeth. "Return it to me, foolish mortal, and your death will be swift." I stood frozen, the fetish clutched in my white-knuckled grip, my mind a perfect blank of sheer terror. The skinwalker took one gliding step forward, stick limbs moving with an obscene boneless grace. "Don't do it," John suddenly yelled, startling me out of my stupor. "Destroy the damn thing before it can get its claws on it." He started frantically digging through his pockets, searching for something. The skinwalker's head whipped towards him, a chilling snarl building in its throat. Then several things seemed to happen at once. The skinwalker lunged forward with supernatural speed, covering the distance of the meadow in a single heart's beat. At the same time, John found what he was looking for, his grandpa's old Zippo lighter. He snatched the talisman from my limp fingers, flicked the lighter to life, and touched the flame to the desiccated twigs and sinew. The effect was immediate and explosive. The skinwalker reared back with an ungodly shriek, a sound of equal parts agony and fury that sent daggers of pain lancing through my head. Greasy black smoke poured from the talisman as it burst into sickly green flames. The skinwalker's form seemed to waver and run like melting wax, its outline blurring. With a final soul-rending wail, the creature dissolved into a vortex of foul smoke and embers that swirled away on the rising wind. The fetish crumbled into ash in John's grip, sifting through his fingers to dust the forest floor. For a long moment we stood there trembling, hardly daring to believe it was over. Then as one we turned and got the hell out of there, not stopping until we had put a dozen miles and the safety of civilization between us and that cursed glade. We never spoke of what happened in those woods again. The experience was too raw, too scarring. I think we all privately hoped that if we just didn't acknowledge it, we could pretend it never happened, that it was all just a shared hallucination or mass delusion born of isolation and overactive imaginations. But that chilling wail still haunts my nightmares, and sometimes I catch a flicker of movement at the corner of my eye, there and gone between one blink and the next. And in those moments I wonder if we truly defeated the skinwalker that day, or merely delayed the inevitable. If one day I'll awake to find those malevolent green eyes staring into mine, hear that voice like crumbling tombstones whisper, "I have finally found you," and then there will be no escape. My name's Eli Stanton, and I've lived off the grid for nearly a decade now. The dense forests of northern Maine have been my home, my sanctuary, and my escape from a world that once threatened to consume me. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when I was just another cog in the machine, a systems analyst for a big tech firm in Boston. The job paid well, but it sucked the life out of me, one pixel at a time. I still remember the day everything changed. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way, until the phone call that shattered my world. My wife Laura had been in a car accident. By the time I made it to the hospital, she was gone. The doctors said it was instantaneous, that she didn't suffer. But I suffered. I suffered because I knew that if I hadn't been so absorbed in my work, so glued to my screens, I might have been there to pick her up from her art class like I'd promised. The guilt ate at me, gnawing away at my insides until there was nothing left but a hollow shell of the man I used to be. I couldn't bear to look at another computer screen, couldn't stand the constant buzz of notifications that seemed to mock my loss. So, I made a decision that some might call drastic, but to me, it was the only way to preserve what was left of my sanity. I sold everything I could, gave away the rest, and used what little money I had left to buy a small, rundown cabin deep in the Maine woods. It was miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became impassable during the harsh winter months. But that suited me just fine. I wanted isolation. I craved it. The cabin itself was nothing special when I first arrived. It was a simple log structure, weathered by years of neglect, with a tin roof that leaked when it rained and windows that rattled in the wind. But it was mine, and over the years, I've poured my heart and soul into making it a home. I learned to hunt, to fish, to identify edible plants in the forest. I chopped wood for the long winters, patched the roof, and reinforced the walls. Slowly but surely, the cabin transformed, much like I did. It became sturdy, self-sufficient, a testament to survival in the face of adversity. Living alone suits me. There's a purity in nature that you don't find in city life. It's quiet, predictable. The rhythms of the forest became my heartbeat. The whisper of the wind through the pines my lullaby. I found peace in the solitude, a sense of purpose in the daily struggle for survival. But nature, I would soon learn, isn't always predictable. And sometimes the quiet hides secrets darker than any urban nightmare. It was a night like any other, or so I thought. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the scent of pine and decay. I sat on my porch, a steaming mug of coffee in my hands, watching the sun dip below the tree line. The forest was alive with the usual evening sounds, the rustle of leaves, the call of birds settling in for the night, the scurrying of small animals in the underbrush. I've grown accustomed to these sounds over the years. They're comforting in their familiarity, a reminder that life goes on regardless of human concerns. I can identify most of the local wildlife by sound alone now. The soft hoot of a barred owl, the chatter of a red squirrel, even the distant howl of the occasional wolf pack. But as the last rays of sunlight faded, painting the sky in hues of purple and orange, I heard something different. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It started as a low, throaty rumble, so deep I felt it more than heard it. At first I thought it might be distant thunder, but the sky was clear, stars just beginning to twinkle into view. Then I considered it might be a bear. We have a few up here, mostly black bears that keep to themselves, but this was different. The sound came again, louder this time, closer. It vibrated in my chest, set my teeth on edge. It was primal, ancient, something that spoke to a part of my brain I didn't know existed, a part that screamed danger. I stood up, my coffee forgotten, and tried to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. The forest was dense, the underbrush thick this time of year, making it hard to see much beyond the tree line. Shadows stretched long and dark, playing tricks on my eyes. The noise came a third time, and this time I was sure it was moving, getting closer. Without thinking, I retreated into the cabin, my heart pounding. I grabbed my rifle, an old Remington my father had given me years ago. It was a comforting weight in my hands, a connection to a past that seemed impossibly distant now. I'm not one to scare easily. You can't live out here alone if you jump at every shadow or unusual sound. But something about that noise triggered a deep-seated instinct in me. Something that said this wasn't a normal animal. This was something else entirely. I stepped back onto the porch, rifle at the ready, and peered into the gathering darkness. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to have died down. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting. And then I saw it, a shadow, darker than the rest, moving at the edge of the clearing. It was big, much bigger than a bear, and it moved with a fluid grace that sent chills down my spine. For a moment our eyes met across the distance. I couldn't make out any details in the fading light, but I felt its gaze lock onto me. Intelligent, calculating, hungry. And then it was gone, melting back into the forest as if it had never been there at all. I stood there for a long time, my rifle trained on the spot where I'd seen the creature, barely daring to breathe, but nothing else happened. Eventually, the normal sounds of the forest returned. A hesitant chirp here, a rustle there, as if the woodland creatures were cautiously checking to see if the coast was clear. As the adrenaline faded, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a bear, unusually large and moving strangely in the shadows. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, fatigue and isolation finally taking their toll. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever I'd seen out there, it wasn't something that belonged in these woods. It wasn't something that should exist at all. That night, for the first time since I'd moved to the cabin, I locked my door. Sleep eluded me that night. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the events of the evening, trying to make sense of what I'd seen and heard. Every creak of the cabin's old timber, every whisper of wind outside, had me sitting bolt upright, rifle in hand. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I made a decision. I needed to investigate, to find some concrete evidence of what was out there, if only to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I geared up as if for a long hunting trip, sturdy boots, layers of warm clothing, a pack with water and provisions, my trusty Remington, of course, and a hunting knife at my belt. As an afterthought, I grabbed my old digital camera. If I did find something out there, I wanted proof. The morning was crisp and clear, dew sparkling on every leaf and blade of grass. Under the bright light of day, last night's fears seemed almost silly. Almost. I set out in the direction I'd seen the creature disappear, moving slowly and carefully. Years of hunting had taught me how to move quietly through the underbrush, how to spot signs of animal passage. But as I ventured deeper into the forest, I realized I wasn't seeing any of the usual signs of wildlife. No droppings, no tufts of fur caught on branches. Even the birds were unnaturally quiet. It was as if everything was hiding. After about an hour of careful progress, I stumbled upon something that made me pause. A clearing. One I'd never noticed before despite my many forays into these woods. It wasn't large, maybe the size of my cabin's main room, but it was perfectly circular, too perfect to be natural. In the center of the clearing stood the remains of a deer, or what was left of it. The animal had been torn apart, entrails spilling out onto the ground, its eyes wide open and clouded in death. But it wasn't the gruesome sight that held my attention. It was the tracks around it. They were massive, easily twice the size of my boot print. They had the general shape of a canine's paw, but elongated, with claws that left deep gouges in the earth. I knelt down to get a closer look, running my hand over the edge of one of the prints. It was fresh, too fresh. I fumbled for my camera, snapping several pictures of the prints and the deer carcass. As I stood up, a twig snapped somewhere behind me. I spun around, rifle raised, but there was nothing there, just trees, shadows, and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My heart was pounding in my chest, sweat trickling down my back despite the cool air. I wasn't sure what I was dealing with, but I knew it was dangerous, something beyond the natural order of things. I decided to head back to the cabin. Whatever was out here, I wasn't equipped to deal with it alone. I needed time to think, to plan, maybe to reach out to someone who might have answers. As I made my way back, moving as quickly and quietly as I could, my mind raced. I'd never been one to believe in legends or folklore, but out here alone, with something unknown stalking the woods, those old tales my grandfather used to tell didn't seem so far-fetched. He'd spoken of creatures that lived in the deep woods, beyond the reach of civilization, ancient things that had been here long before humans set foot on this land. Things that most people had forgotten, but that still remembered us. I reached the cabin and bolted the door behind me, something I hadn't done since I first moved out here. The cabin was sturdy, built by hand with thick logs and a reinforced door. I told myself that whatever was out there wouldn't be able to get in, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. As I downloaded the pictures from my camera to my rarely used laptop, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed a line, that by seeking out whatever was out there, I'd drawn its attention. And now, it was hunting me. The hours dragged by as I sat in the growing darkness, the rifle across my lap, listening. The forest was quiet again, unnervingly so. I thought about turning on the generator for some light, but the thought of the noise it would make stopped me. I didn't want to draw attention, not to this place, not to myself. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds before fading to an inky black, I found myself thinking about my life before the cabin, about Laura, about the life we'd planned together. We'd talked about having kids, about moving to a quiet suburb where we could have a garden and a dog. It all seemed so distant now, like a half-remembered dream. I wondered what Laura would think of me now, living alone in the woods, jumping at shadows. Would she be proud of how I'd learned to survive on my own? Or would she be sad to see how isolated I'd become? My musings were interrupted by a sound that made my blood run cold. That same low, throaty rumble I'd heard the night before. But closer now, much closer. I stood up slowly, careful not to make a sound, and moved to the window. The moonlight cast long shadows across the forest floor, and for a moment I thought maybe it had been my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I saw it. Standing just at the edge of the trees, partially obscured by shadows, was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was huge, easily the size of a grizzly bear, but it moved with a fluidity that was almost feline. Its fur was dark, matted in places, and I could make out a long, narrow snout filled with sharp, jagged teeth. The closest thing I could compare it to was a hyena, but far more grotesque, more monstrous. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural intelligence, fixed on the cabin, fixed on me. And then it did something that made my heart nearly stop. It stood up on its hind legs. No animal should be able to do that. Not like this. It was almost humanoid in the way it moved, the way it stood, towering over the ground, and then it let out a sound that was halfway between a howl and a scream, a noise that echoed through the trees and set the night alive with movement. I could hear the distant calls of other animals responding, the forest suddenly alive with activity. But I barely registered it, my entire focus on the creature outside my cabin. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I took aim and fired, the sound of the gunshot deafening in the enclosed space of the cabin. The creature recoiled, a dark liquid, blood, I assumed, spraying from its shoulder. But it didn't fall. Instead, it dropped back onto all fours and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. I stayed up the rest of the night, rifle in hand, listening for any sign that it might return. But the forest remained quiet, the only sounds those of the wind rustling through the leaves and the distant call of an owl. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside, my legs shaky from the tension of the night. The clearing was empty, the only sign of what had happened being the bloodstains on the ground where I had shot the creature. I followed the trail as far as I could, but it eventually disappeared into the underbrush, the ground too rocky to hold any more tracks. Whatever that thing was, it was gone, for now. As I made my way back to the cabin, my mind was reeling. I'd lived out here for years, and I'd seen my share of strange things, but nothing like this. It wasn't a bear or a wolf or anything else that should be in these woods. It was something else. Something old and dangerous. I knew I should probably leave, head into town and report what I'd seen. But who would believe me? And more importantly, could I bring myself to abandon the life I'd built here, the peace I'd found in these woods? No, I decided. This was my home, and I wasn't about to let some creature, no matter how terrifying, chase me out. But I was going to be a lot more careful from now on. That's for sure. As for what it was, I could only guess. Maybe some kind of ancient predator that's managed to stay hidden all these years. Maybe something that's always been here, just waiting for the right moment to show itself. But whatever it was out there, somewhere in those woods, and I had a feeling it would be back. Next time, though, I'll be ready. The days following my encounter with the creature were filled with a tense, watchful silence. I spent hours reinforcing the cabin's defenses, boarding up windows, setting up primitive alarms around the perimeter, anything I could think of to give myself an edge when, it returned. But as the days stretched into weeks with no sign of the beast, I found myself questioning my own memories. Had it really been as large as I remembered? As intelligent? Or had fear and isolation warped my perceptions? I pored over the photos I'd taken in the clearing, studying every pixel for clues. The tracks were real enough, as was the savage deer carcass, but neither provided concrete proof of what I'd seen that night. It was during this time that I realized how truly cut off I'd become from the rest of the world. I had no one to confide in, no one to seek advice from. The isolation that had once been my solace now felt suffocating. After much internal debate, I decided to make the trek into town. It was a grueling 6-hour hike to the nearest settlement, a small logging community called Millridge. I hadn't been there in over a year, and as I approached, I felt like a ghost returning to the land of the living. The town hadn't changed much. A handful of stores along the main street, a diner that had seen better days, and the ever-present hum of logging trucks in the distance. I made my way to the local library, a small, single-story building that smelled of old books and dust. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hodgson, looked up in surprise as I entered. "Eli Stanton, is that you? Good Lord, we thought you'd gone and disappeared on us." I managed a weak smile. "Just been keeping to myself, Mrs. Hodgson. Listen, I was wondering if you had any books on local folklore, legends, myths, that sort of thing. She raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. Instead, she led me to a small section at the back of the library. Not much call for these usually, she said, running a finger along the spines of several old worn books. But we've got a few. Anything in particular you're looking for? I hesitated. How could I explain what I'd seen without sounding crazy? I'm interested in stories about creatures. In the woods. Anything unusual or unexplained. Mrs. Hodgson's face changed. A flicker of something. Fear? Recognition? Passing across it before she composed herself. Well, she said quietly, you might want to start with this one. She pulled out a thin leather-bound volume titled Shadows in the Pines, Forgotten Legends of the North Woods. As I reached for the book, Mrs. Hodgson grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong for someone her age. Be careful, Eli, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Some things are best left in the dark. Before I could respond, she had turned and shuffled back to her desk, leaving me alone with the book and a growing sense of unease. I spent the next few hours poring over the volume, my heart racing as I came across a section titled The Beast of Blackwood Forest. The description matched what I'd seen, a massive wolf-like creature that walked on two legs, with intelligence in its eyes and an appetite for flesh. According to the book, sightings of the beast dated back centuries, with the earliest recorded encounter in 1673 by a French trapper. The stories were remarkably consistent over time, a creature that seemed to blur the line between animal and something else. What struck me most was a passage near the end of the section. The beast is said to be drawn to isolation and despair. It preys not just on the flesh, but on the very soul of those who have cut themselves off from the world of men. I closed the book, my hands shaking. It was as if the author had reached across time to speak directly to me, to my situation. As I left the library, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. I knew I should start the long trek back to my cabin, but something made me hesitate. The thought of returning to that isolation, of facing whatever was out there alone, filled me with a dread I couldn't shake. I found myself at the town's only motel, a rundown place called the Pine View Inn. The clerk looked surprised to see a customer, but handed over a key without much conversation. That night, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the occasional passing car and the hum of the ancient air conditioner, I made a decision. I couldn't go back to the cabin. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I spent the next week in Millridge, slowly reacclimating to the presence of other people. I took odd jobs here and there, helping out at the hardware store, doing some basic computer work for the town office. It felt strange, using skills I'd almost forgotten I had. But as the days passed, I found myself growing restless. The town, which had seemed so alive when I first arrived, now felt stifling. I missed the quiet of the forest, the self-reliance of my life there. And more than that, I felt a growing sense of unfinished business. Whatever that creature was, it was still out there. And if the legends were true, it would keep hunting, keep killing. On the 8th day, I packed up my meager belongings and headed back into the woods. The hike seemed shorter this time, my steps purposeful and determined. As I approached my cabin, I half expected to find it destroyed, torn apart by the beast in my absence. But it stood just as I'd left it, a testament to the solidity of its construction and the peace of the forest around it. I spent the next few days preparing. I reinforced the doors and windows, set up more alarms around the perimeter. I cleaned my rifle and stocked up on ammunition, and I waited. It was on the third night that I heard it again, that low rumbling growl that set my teeth on edge. But this time I was ready. I stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, and called out into the darkness. I know you're out there. Show yourself. For a long moment there was silence. Then from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, it emerged. It was just as I remembered. Massive, with matted dark fur and eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence. But this time I didn't feel fear. I felt recognition, as if I was facing a part of myself I'd long denied. The creature stood on its hind legs, towering over me. But it didn't attack. Instead, it tilted its head, as if considering me. In that moment, I understood. The beast wasn't just a predator. It was loneliness given form. Isolation made flesh. It was everything I'd embraced when I'd cut myself off from the world. taken to its terrible logical conclusion. I lowered my rifle. "I'm not alone anymore," I said, my voice steady, "and neither are you." The creature let out a sound, not a growl this time, but something almost like a sigh. Then, slowly, it turned and loped back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there for a long time, watching the spot where it had vanished. I knew it might return someday. The darkness, the isolation, they're always there, waiting at the edges of our lives. But for now, at least, they were gone. And I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I began the long hike back to Millridge. It was time to rejoin the world, to find a balance between the solitude I craved and the human connection I needed. As I walked, I thought about Laura, about the life we'd planned. I thought about the years I'd spent alone in these woods, and I thought about the future, uncertain, yes, but full of possibilities. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of birds, of small animals going about their lives. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint rumble of a logging truck. I smiled. It was good to be back. It's been 2 years since that night in the woods. I still live in my cabin, but I make regular trips into town now. I've even started doing some freelance IT work, using a satellite internet connection to stay connected to the outside world. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I hear that low growl in the distance. But it doesn't fill me with fear anymore. Instead, it's a reminder of the darkness we all carry inside us, and of the importance of facing it head-on. I don't know if what I saw was real, or some manifestation of my own lonely psyche. But in the end, I suppose it doesn't matter. What matters is that I found my way back, to myself, to the world. And if you ever find yourself in the deep woods of northern Maine, and you hear something moving in the shadows, well, maybe it's just the wind, or maybe it's something else. Something ancient and lonely, waiting for someone to understand. Just remember, the real monsters aren't in the forest. They're the ones we create when we cut ourselves off from the world, when we forget what it means to be human. Stay connected, stay alive, and never stop moving forward.